It was once said that protest beyond the law is not a departure from democracy. It is absolutely essential to it. Indeed, the power of protest is a testament to the vitality of democracy, embodying its core values of freedom of expression and the right to dissent. Throughout history, anti-war protests have emerged as pivotal moments of civic engagement, often signaling significant dissent within a populace regarding national or international policies. These protests, whether against the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, the nuclear arms race in the 80s, or more recent conflicts in Yemen and Syria, have been instrumental in shaping societal responses to conflict. They serve as a clarion call for peace, urging society to reconsider the costs of war and the value of human life. As we take this journey through history, remember, this is not just about the past. It's about the power of the people to shape the future. The Vietnam War era, a time of social unrest and powerful protest movements. In the 60s and 70s, the streets of America were filled with voices crying out against a war that was tearing apart the fabric of society. This was the era of Vietnam War protests, led primarily by students, political activists, and intellectuals, with significant participation from civil rights groups and various religious organizations. These protesters took to the streets, university campuses, and even to the steps of government buildings, engaging in marches, sit-ins, and university campus strikes. They made their voices heard, their messages clear, with symbolic actions such as draft card burnings and the iconic flower power movements. These actions were not just about opposition to the war, but a broader call for peace, justice, and a change in the direction of national policy. However, these protests were met with stern, often severe, responses from the government. Law enforcement agencies cracked down on protests, resulting in mass arrests and, at times, violent clashes. The tragic events at Kent State University in 1970 stand out as a stark example of this. 4 students were killed and 9 others injured when the National Guard opened fire on a crowd of protesters, an event that sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. Despite these harsh responses, the Vietnam War protests persisted, growing in strength and numbers. They marked a pivotal moment in American history, signaling a significant dissent within the populace regarding national and international policies. The protests did more than just voice opposition to the Vietnam War. They sparked a broader debate about the role of government, the nature of democracy, and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. The Vietnam War protests were a turning point, a clear demonstration of the people's power to challenge government policies. They highlighted the potential of civic engagement and collective action, lessons that continue to resonate in the protests and movements of today. Fast forward to the 1980s, a decade marked by fear of nuclear war and the rise of grassroots movements. The specter of nuclear annihilation loomed large, and public sentiment was increasingly against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This era witnessed some of the largest and most influential anti-nuclear protests in history. Across NATO countries, particularly in Europe, grassroots movements sprung up like daisies in a field. Ordinary citizens, not just political activists, were galvanized into action, unified by a shared dread of nuclear conflict. One of the most notable was the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp in the UK. Here, women, mothers, daughters, and sisters alike took a stand against nuclear weapons, setting up a peace camp that endured for almost 2 decades. The anti-nuclear protests were characterized by their innovative tactics. protesters formed human chains that stretched for miles, linking arms in a symbolic gesture of unity against nuclear weapons. They established peace camps, living embodiments of their commitment to a non-nuclear world. They blockaded military bases, directly disrupting the operation of nuclear facilities. The government's responses to these protests varied widely. Some initially dismissed the protesters as naive idealists, while others kept a watchful eye through surveillance. Yet, the sheer scale of these protests could not be ignored. The public's fear of nuclear war, expressed through these protests, began to influence policy decisions. In some cases, governments were prompted to rethink their strategies around missile deployments. The anti-nuclear protests of the 1980s demonstrated the power of collective action. They showed that grassroots movements, armed with conviction and the courage to stand against the prevailing winds of policy, could sway the course of governmental decisions. It was a testament to the strength of people's voices when united for a common cause. The anti-nuclear protests showed the world that the people's voice could shape policy decisions. It was a powerful reminder that when people stand together, they can influence the direction their world takes. In recent years, new conflicts have sparked protests, powered by digital technology and global solidarity. Let's explore some of these movements. The Yemen civil war, ongoing since 2015, has triggered significant anti-war activism. Human rights groups, Yemeni diaspora, and international activists have played pivotal roles in these protests. The actions of these groups have been diverse, ranging from social media campaigns to demonstrations in major cities worldwide. They've also lobbied governments to halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which is deeply involved in the conflict. Government responses, especially in the West, have been limited in terms of crackdowns on protesters. However, the success of lobbying efforts in influencing foreign policy has varied greatly. Turning our attention to Syria, where a brutal civil war has been raging since 2011, we find another active anti-war movement. The Syrian diaspora, along international human rights organizations, have held vigils and protests and used digital activism to highlight the humanitarian crisis and the use of chemical weapons. The government response in Syria has been brutally suppressive. Internationally, responses have been more about managing refugee flows and exerting diplomatic pressures rather than directly engaging with protesters. Lastly, we have the anti-genocide movements, most notably the protests against the Uyghur genocide. The Uyghur diaspora, human rights activists, the broader Muslim community, and international coalitions have been at the forefront of these movements. Their actions have included rallies, lobbying for sanctions, petitions, and extensive use of digital platforms to raise awareness. Government responses have varied significantly, with some governments imposing sanctions and others choosing diplomatic silence, partly due to economic ties with China. Adding another layer to this global tapestry of protest, we've recently seen university protests in support of Palestinians in Gaza. These movements have drawn together students, faculty members, and others who stand in solidarity with Palestinians. They've adopted several strategies, including advocating for human rights, calling for an end to the conflict, and organizing rallies and marches on campuses worldwide. Their use of digital has helped raise awareness and garner international support, reinforcing the power of such tools in modern activism. So, what do these recent conflicts and responses tell us? Firstly, the use of digital platforms is now integral to organizing protests. This has allowed for faster, broader mobilization and international solidarity. a stark contrast to historical protests, which relied more on physical presence and print media. Secondly, the participants. Today's protests are more likely to draw international participants and attention, reflecting globalization's role in linking disparate groups against common issues. This has also meant that state responses must consider international as well as domestic repercussions. Finally, state responses. While historical protests often face severe state repression, modern protests can still encounter harsh responses, but are also more likely to influence policy, especially when they garner international attention and support. These recent protests reveal the evolving nature of anti-war movements and the power of digital technology in amplifying voices. From the 1960s to today, the nature of protests has changed, but the power of the people remains strong. As we delve deeper, we can notice significant differences and similarities between historical and present-day anti-war protests, especially in terms of tactics, technology, and the impact of globalization. Historically, protests relied heavily on physical presence. Whether it was the student-led marches against the Vietnam War or the human chains formed during the anti-nuclear protests, people had to be there on the ground. They disseminated information through word of mouth and print media, like posters and pamphlets. Fast forward to today, the scene has changed dramatically. Modern movements leverage digital technology extensively. Social media platforms and other online tools have become the new norm for organizing, publicizing, and executing protests. This shift to digital platforms has allowed for faster, broader mobilization and fostered international solidarity. Globalization, too, has left its mark. Today's protests are more likely to draw international participants and attention, reflecting globalization's role in linking disparate groups against common issues. The Yemen Civil War protests or the anti-genocide movements are prime examples of this. And this global attention has also meant that state responses must consider international as well as domestic repercussions. Speaking of state responses, they have evolved as well. While historical protests like those against the Vietnam War often faced severe state repression, modern protests can encounter similarly harsh responses. However, they are also more likely to influence government policies, as we've seen with lobbying efforts to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia or impose sanctions in response to the Uyghur genocide. In essence, while the tools and tactics have changed, the common thread running through all these protests is the power of the people. Be it in the 1960s or the present day, it's the people's power that challenges and shapes government policies. While the tools and tactics have changed, the essence of protest remains the same: the people's power to challenge and shape government policies. What are your thoughts on the protests lately? Do they compare to protests of the past? Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate all of you that engage with my channel. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.